Hi, welcome to this presentation on IBM Spectrum Protect Plus version 10.1.7 on Azure Marketplace. My name is Trisha Jong, and I will first be covering a higher level introduction to this solution, and then I'll go into some more technical details. Azure now offers an automatic deployment of Spectrum Protect Plus into your Azure VNet, and this deployment has two possibilities. Either you can do a all-on cloud deployment where we're deploying both the Spectrum Protect Plus server as well as a vSnap directly into your Microsoft Azure. Or we can do a hybrid deployment where just a vSnap is deployed into Microsoft Azure and we're connecting with an on-premise Spectrum Protect Plus server. When these solutions are deployed, an SLA is created automatically inside the Spectrum Protect Plus server that references the new vSnap as well as the optional Azure Blob storage that can be used to offload the backups from the vSnap to the less expensive Azure Blob storage for long-term retention. Both of these solutions protect the databases and applications that are running in the Azure cloud, whether this is Office 365, Exchange, Oracle, MongoDB, DB2, SQL servers, or some of the Windows file systems. In addition, the hybrid solution does provide a replication target for your on-premise vSnaps to the cloud vSnap, thus giving you DR directly into the cloud. So in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to be going through the details of how these two different solutions are deployed, the requirements, the licensing, and so forth. I do have a demo of actually doing the deployment out on YouTube, so do check that out as well. So in addition to the protection of the different databases and applications and the replication between the Spectrum Protect Plus on-premise vSnaps, we can also offload data to blob object storage for long-term retention, and we can easily reuse that we're storing in the vSnaps directly inside of Azure. Now, this is an infrastructure as a service offering, meaning that the Spectrum Protect Plus server and vSnap, if it's an all-on cloud solution, are automatically deployed and configured, included as reporting, error messaging, and everything else. But the customer will manage the upgrades to different versions of Spectrum Protect Plus, the daily maintenance and running of Spectrum Protect Plus, and the customization of the Spectrum Protect Plus environment. This offering became available on February 17th. You can access it by going out to your Azure portal and searching on IBM Spectrum Protect Plus. This is what it'll look like when you drill down into the template. Now, the resources to run this, the CPU, the disk, is going to be purchased from Azure. The license for the Spectrum Protect Plus software comes from IBM. And we do have a free trial that goes with that license if you want to try it out for 30 days, but that would just be the software license. The deployment guide, if you want to read more about the solution and figure out, for instance, if you want the hybrid or all-in-cloud solution, check out the deployment guide. So just to be clear, this is not a backup as a service. We do deploy the software, but then you, the customer, actually manage, run, and act as the backup administrator for that Spectrum Protect Plus server and vSnap. So why do we want this IBM data resiliency solution out on the cloud? Well, when we talk about cloud workloads, we need to be able to consistently manage both our on-prem as well as our cloud backup solutions. So if you're already using Spectrum Protect Plus on-premise, you can easily now also use it for your cloud applications and databases. With cloud, you're only using the physical resources that you need, and as you need to grow those, you can also increase the size of your Azure footprint. And by having this self-deployment where you don't have to go and actually do the installation yourself, we're making it easier to deploy and get your Spectrum Protect Plus server and vSnap up and running. Of course, all of your applications running in the cloud need to be protected just like your on-premise applications, and you need to have the flexibility to either deploy your Spectrum Protect Plus server in the cloud or to have it as a hybrid solution where it utilizes your existing on-premise Spectrum Protect Plus server. And then, of course, the nice thing with the cloud implementation is the flexibility for pricing options. where you are just paying for what you're using in the hardware-wise. And when it comes to Spectrum Protect Plus, you have our built-in flexibility. You have the worldwide data access and worldwide support access that comes with the Microsoft Azure solution. So some of Spectrum Protect Plus's key capabilities are its cost. It's easy to deploy and manage. It has agentless deployment for the backup of the different application and databases it protects. It has a proactive backup catalog that is able to do things like replicate as well as offload older data to cheaper storage. It efficiently uses storage using a single instancing, dedupe, and compression, and it is software defined. When it comes to management, this is a self-service offering with a lot of automation and orchestration built in and a RESTful API that you can customize further. We have nice performance enhancements like instant recovery and instant data access for data reuse built into the Spectrum Protect Plus vSnaps. And of course, when it comes to cloud, we work in the Azure Marketplace and have that automatic deployment built in. And all of this brings out cyber resiliency where you can, when you're doing your recovery, recover into a fenced environment. You can use things like encryption on your vSnap, as well as you can use our instant recovery to do automatic testing for resiliency. Slide 7 just covers what's new in Spectrum Protect Plus since version 10.1.3. So if you haven't been following the new features that we've put out, you can go out and check out the different YouTube videos on these different versions. Now, when it comes to the purchasing and pricing, the customer is going to pay for the Spectrum Protect license, and usually this is purchased via Passport Advantage. And then they're going to pay Azure for their in-cloud vSnap and resources that the Spectrum Protect Plus server sits on, as well as any blob storage that they utilize. So when you're planning to utilize the Spectrum Protect Plus and Azure deployment, you will want to first size out your Spectrum Protect Plus environment, whether it's just a vSnap or it's an all-in-cloud solution. So we do suggest you go out to the Spectrum Protect Plus blueprints and walk through our sizing tool so that you understand how big your vSnap needs to be, as well as if you're going to be using dedupe inside of that vSnap. And that will ultimately impact the selections we show you for what type of virtual machine you'll be deploying into the Azure environment that'll contain your Spectrum Protect Plus vSnap. So when you go through this blueprint sizing tool, in the end, you'll have a vSnap size as well as if you're going to turn on or off dedupe. And those will be inserted directly into this step, vSnap server configuration, which we'll talk about in a minute, when you're doing the setup inside of Azure. We chose a 12 terabyte vSnap server repository, and we disabled dedupe. And then the deployment will automatically bring up suggested vSnap server virtual machines that will meet those qualifications. And then you can choose which one you want to utilize from there. Let's go ahead and dig into some technical details on how to deploy the Spectrum Protect Plus vSnap and alternately the Spectrum Protect Plus server into Azure. Slide 16 is just an overview of some of the Azure components. The pieces that are going to be of interest to us are the Azure Virtual Machine. And Spectrum Protect Plus uses an ESv4 virtual machine to deploy its vSnaps on. So I'll go through and point out where you need to verify that your geographic and locale supports those ESv4s inside of Azure. We'll talk about the virtual network, also called a VNet. And the reason this is important is that you can either use an existing VNet inside of Azure or we can deploy a new one. I'll show you Azure Marketplace and how we get started and find the Spectrum Protect Plus solution from there. We'll talk about the permissions that are needed for the Azure Resource Manager and how the resource group will act kind of like as a folder that will contain all of our deployed resources inside of Azure. Azure Blob Object Storage can optionally be defined as a lower cost long-term retention storage for our backups. So I'll show you where you'll make that choice. And finally, a Bastion host is important because this is one of the ways you can get into a Spectrum Protect Plus server that's sitting out in Azure. And I'll show you how you can go through and link into that Bastion host to access the Spectrum Protect Plus server, which is sitting inside of the cloud. On slide 17, I'm showing you what an all-on-cloud solution looks like. Here you can see we have the Spectrum Protect Plus server deployed, as well as the vSnap server and repository, and then optionally the blob storage. So we would be protecting the databases and applications that are running inside of Azure. The initial backups would be going to the vSnap server, and then optionally you could offload those backups to cheaper storage out on blob storage for long-term retention. So our first use case is simply backing up these applications. The second use case would be to replicate this vSnap server with another location, perhaps inside of the cloud or on-premise. And the third use case would be offloading those backups to blob storage for long-term retention. Now, when we do all-in-cloud, this option might benefit new IBM Spectrum Protect users who want to protect their databases and applications that are inside of Azure but have not yet set up an on-premise Spectrum Protect Plus server. So that will give them the complete data protection. It'll allow for the protection of the workloads on Azure. They'll be able to copy them to blob storage for long-term retention. They'll be able to have disaster recovery by bringing up another Spectrum Protect Plus instance if needed inside of the cloud. And of course, they'll be able to reuse their backed up resources, spin up test cases and things like that from their backups directly into the cloud. The second solution would be a hybrid solution. So here we have an existing corporate data center with an existing Spectrum Protect Plus server and vSnap. And then out in Azure, we're going to deploy another vSnap server and repository and optionally blob storage. And so now in this case, the workloads that are running inside of Azure will be backed up to the Azure Cloud vSnap server and optionally offloaded for long-term retention down to the blob storage. And then the on-premise and off-premise vSnap can replicate to each other as a form of disaster recovery. And now you have multiple choices on where you restore your workloads from, either from the Azure vSnap or from the on-premise vSnap if you've replicated over there. So this type of hybrid environment might work well for a customer who already has Spectrum Protect Plus server installed on site, and they'll still have all of the same use cases as an all-in-cloud solution with the additional ability to replicate between their on-premise and Azure site. Another choice that the customer has to make before deploying is if they're going to deploy into an existing VNet or into a new VNet. And so we can do both all-on-cloud or hybrid with an existing or new VNet. But one thing to notice is that if you are deploying a new VNet into a hybrid environment, meaning your Spectrum Protect server already exists, this automatic deployment cannot automatically define the new vSnap to the on-premise Spectrum Protect Plus server, nor can we define the optional blob storage to the existing Spectrum Protect Plus server. So you'll have to wait until you've created a connection with your on-premise Spectrum Protect Plus server and the Azure, and then manually define in those two pieces. So this is what an all-on-cloud deployment into a new or existing VNet will look like. Here, of course, you have both your Spectrum Protect Plus server and vSnap being able to communicate directly with each other. If you're wanting to access the Spectrum Protect Plus server from your home or office, you will need to go through a Bastion server, and I'll show you how to set that up so that you can access the Spectrum Protect Plus server. In a hybrid environment, either new or existing VNet, you will need to set up a VPN tunnel between your on-premise Spectrum Protect Plus server and a VPN gateway that works in conjunction with your vSnap that's deployed into Azure. This slide covers the permissions that are required for the administrator who's doing the deployment inside of Azure. Notice that they're slightly different depending upon if it's an all-in-cloud or if it's a hybrid deployment. And if you do choose to deploy into an existing VNet, you will have to make sure that any of these resources with an asterisk next to them, like the virtual network, public static IPs, NAT gateways, subnets, already exist. These are the resources that are required to deploy IBM Spectrum Protect Plus on Microsoft Azure. So you'll see for the Spectrum Protect Plus server, which would be all in cloud. We do require an ESV4 series virtual machine, and then the disks we mentioned here as well. Now these disk types will automatically show up once you make this selection. You won't be able to force the disk types or the virtual machines. And then of course with the vSnap server, here's what we support as well. ESV4 series as well as the BS series. Now the important thing to note is that you have to make sure that these virtual machines are available in your selected deployment region. Otherwise, the deployment will fail. And if you want to check that VM regional availability, you can go out to this Microsoft document. Microsoft keeps deploying its ESV4 into additional geographies on a regular basis, so you'll want to make sure you've checked the most recent availability. Now the ARM template is going to set up and configure the following components depending if you're doing an all-in cloud or if you're doing a hybrid. So for the Spectrum Protect Plus server, which is an all-in cloud deployment, the Spectrum Protect server virtual machine is going to include 70 gigabytes of premium SSD disk, 50 gigabytes for the Postgres SQL, 50 gigabytes for the MongoDB, and 150 gigabytes for the Lucent indexing. Whereas the vSnap, which we deploy whether it's a hybrid or all on cloud, is going to need at least 70 gigabytes of solid state disk volumes for the root volume, and then whatever you specify as your vSnap size for the rest of that. Now the deployed components are going to depend on, once again, if you're doing a hybrid or an all-in cloud, and if you're deploying into an existing or into a new VNet. But you will see all of these components being put into the same resource group that we defined, so those will show up there. The quota requirements are important because the Spectrum Protect Plus server and vSnap will require a lot more than are in the standard out-of-the-box quota on Azure. So you may need as many as 20 cores or greater for the implementation of this. So you might have to send Azure a quota request, and I did put that link down here. If you don't have enough cores available, the install will fail. As I said earlier, before you start this deployment, you will want to use our blueprint synthesizer to determine how large of a vSnap server repository you'll need, and if you're going to utilize deduplication. Once you insert that into our template, the repository size and deduplication, we will automatically bring up pre-configured virtual machine types and sizes to match those vSnap server repository size and deduplication request. And then you can choose from amongst those which one you want to utilize. Now, if you want to calculate the infrastructure cost that Azure is going to charge you, you can go out to the Azure Microsoft calculator here and enter the information that you collected on the previous page, and that will give you an idea of your infrastructure cost on Azure. Remember, the software licensing for Spectrum Protect Plus is bought from IBM. Okay, so the basic deployment steps are, first, you're going to take a look at the deployment guide and determine if you want to do a hybrid or all-in-cloud installation. Then you're going to go through the blueprints to determine your vSnap size and if you're going to use deduplication. Then you'll sign into your Azure account and choose the Spectrum Protect Plus offering, and then click Create on that offering. The deployment is broken into a couple categories. We have the basics, the networking, the Spectrum Protect Plus server, the vSnap server, and then Review and Create. So on the first screen, basics, the important pieces here are going to be the resource group. You'll give this a name, and this is going to act as a folder where Azure installs all of the resources into. You also are going to choose a region, and remember, this region has to support the version 4 VMs that I talked about in the previous slide. You're also going to choose here if you're going to do an all-on-cloud or hybrid installation. And then you'll provide the SSH name, which you've got to remember because you'll be using this SSH name to access your Spectrum Protect Plus assets inside of Azure. Now, the authentication type for this SSH name can either be a password, which of course you'll have to remember, or it can be a public key, which you'll need to generate a new key save that private key, and then paste in the public key into this basic screen. The next screen will be your networking screen. In this, you'll choose if you're going to use an existing or a new virtual network. You'll need to provide the public subnet and the private subnet, as well as the CIDR. Now on this CIDR, make sure you add that slash and then the number, because this will define the network class. If you are using an existing VNet, then you will need to enter the IP address for the Bastion host inside of that existing VNet. The next screen will prompt you for your Spectrum Protect Plus server credentials. Depending if this is a hybrid where you have an existing Spectrum Protect Plus server, and if this is an existing VNet, then you will be prompted for the existing Spectrum Protect Plus server IP, which would have been installed on-premise inside of your IT center. You'll then give it an administrator name. So if it's an existing Spectrum Protect Plus server and a hybrid, you'll already have that name and password. If this is an installation into an all-on cloud, then just create an administrator name and a password you want to use for your Spectrum Protect Plus server. Once again, you need to remember this server name and password in order to be able to get in to the Spectrum Protect Plus server, because we do not use the default out-of-the-box credentials that you'll see if you were to install Spectrum Protect Plus server on site. The next screen will be the vSnap server information. And the first entry will be this repository size. This repository size came from the blueprints and planning sheet you ran in the very beginning, as did the deduplication if you want to enable or disable that. Azure will then automatically generate a list of virtual machines you can choose from, and it'll generate a list of disk types you can choose from. And these disk types, of course, it'll be kind of a performance pricing trade-off when you choose which one you want to use. You will create a vSnap server admin ID as well as password. And remember, once again, you've got to write these down and do not lose these. And then optionally, you can choose a blob container name, and this will be created if it doesn't already exist and used as your offload for long-term retention of your backups. Once you've entered all that information, it will go through and validate that and then allow you to actually click Create. So when you click Create, you'll see this deployment is in progress. And then once it's completed, you'll see your deployment is completed and all of the resources that it actually created out in Azure. Once you've created these resources, you will want to connect to your Spectrum Protect Plus server if you did an all-on-cloud deployment. And so what you want to do is tunnel through your Bastion server in order to be able to access that, or set up your VPN if you want. If you are going to use a Bastion server, then you do need to configure your SSH tunneling. And I do have details on how to do that in the next few slides. And if you watch the demo, I also show you how to do that there. If you're using SSH tunnel port forwarding, it's utilizing SOCKS 5 protocol, and basically we can route our browser communication to the Spectrum Protect Plus web console that's out inside of Azure. So in order to do this, you're going to need to connect the client to the Bastion server using this SSH tunneling and create this SOCKS 5 proxy with a port number. And then you're going to configure your browser to route all communications through that Bastion server using that SOCKS 5 protocol. So in order to do this, you're first of all going to have to record your Spectrum Protect Plus private IP address and the Bastion host server public address. And you'll find these inside of Azure. When you drill down into those resources, it'll give you the details on those IP addresses. Then you're going to issue the following into a PowerShell: the SSH-D, the port, the username that you set up for that SSH when we were doing the setup, and then the Bastion public ID that you copied from inside of the Bastion host. Then you're going to open up a web browser and go into your network settings, where you're going to configure a manual proxy by specifying the SOCKS localhost as well as that 1080 port. And then finally, you'll be able to open up a browser and connect directly to that Spectrum Protect Plus server console out inside of Azure. When it comes to security, we have a couple different levels. The first is when we deploy these new virtual machines for the Spectrum Protect Plus server or vSnap inside of Azure, the default root user is going to be blocked from access, and the vSnap server virtual machines can be accessed either then by the SSH key with the username and password or with the SSH key username that you set up during the installation. Now, Azure does not store this SSH private key or username and password, so if you lose it, we've got some problems there and you won't have access to the vSnap server virtual machine. You will have to apply operating system patches on a periodic basis to the virtual machines that these are deployed on. When it comes to the vSnap and Spectrum Protect Plus server that we deploy into Azure, we do not use the default manufacturing credentials, so those are disabled, and we'll use the credentials that you set up when you're going through the deployment. So you've got to remember that, because if you lose those, you will not be able to access the vSnap or the SPP server login. For security groups, the security groups are created and assigned to the Spectrum Protect Plus and vSnap servers, and the VM instances are part of the solution. They're going to be restricted as much as possible while we still allow access to the various functions that we're going to need to do. So once you have these virtual machines deployed, you can go out into Azure and drill down into them and look at their access and see if you need to restrict or open up those pieces further. Each VM would have its own security group rule configured to allow that inbound and outbound communications. And so once again, you can go into Azure and edit those security groups for further access or restrictions as you required. So you can see we've got the Bastion server, the SPP server, and the vSnap server, and each of those has a network security group assigned to it. The next few slides show some of the common bumps that people might run into. The first is if they want to look at the history and status of the resources that have been deployed. You can go into the monitoring activity log and then drill down, for instance, on failed deployment and see information right down to JSON code on what failed. If you get this error exceeding total approved regional core quota, this means that you need to up your quota for the core so that the Spectrum Protect Plus server and vSnap can be deployed on that all-in-cloud solution. If you get the area, the requested VM size, VM disk type is not available in the current region, that means that the ESv4 series virtual machines have not yet been deployed into the region you chose as your region when you were deploying. So once again, check this Microsoft document because they continue to roll out the v4 to new regions, but you want to make sure your region supports that. Okay, with that, be sure to check out the demo where I go through the actual installation. It's also out on YouTube. Thank you very much.